Climate communications is incredibly important because we have to be able to effectively translate the science to folks who don't understand the science. And if folks don't understand the science, they're less likely to act. So a lot of the work that I do is looking at science, looking at data, and figuring out how to tell a better narrative for a very specific audience, with the hope that they will do something in the end to act, like sign a petition, for example.
That was Nicole Loher, founder of climate communications firm C3. Hello and welcome to the Create Tomorrow podcast. I'm your host, Cassandra Napoli, head of marketing and events insight at WGSN. Every 2 weeks, I will be taking you on a journey, looking at how brands and consumers are creating tomorrow, whether that's through product innovations, actions and strategies, or online behaviors. Today's episode is very important as it comes amid Earth Month and focuses on the rising importance of climate communications. The impact of climate change is becoming more apparent and extreme, challenging countries, organizations, and citizens alike. Language is an essential tool in helping consumers understand and engage with sustainability and recognize the threats of the climate crisis, and that's where businesses like C3 come into play. Joining me to discuss this very important topic in honor of Earth Month is Nicole Loher, founder of C3, a communications firm for the climate crisis, and adjunct professor in climate communications at NYU. Okay, Nicole, can you please tell our listeners who you are and what you do at C3, and also perhaps a bit about how you came to found a climate communications company?
I'm Nicole Loher. I'm the founder of C3, or Climate Communications Collective. We focus on telling stories for the climate crisis. So that's partnering with brands or nonprofits to help them better tell their stories for very targeted audiences. I'm also a professor at New York University, where I teach climate communications, and I've been a professor there for the last decade. I came to founding C3. It's a bit of a long story. I started in luxury fashion and beauty, big fan of WGSN. And I hit this point in my career where I just felt like I was selling and selling and selling. I worked on the digital strategy and communication side of things. And I had this job offer to move to Paris. I said no, and it put me in this interesting spot where I wasn't quite sure of what I would do or how I wanted to spend my time. So I took a little bit of a personal sabbatical. I went back to grad school and got my master's in climate science. And ultimately, when I left, there was no market for climate communications. People had no idea what climate communications was. So I found like a very interesting gray space for me to enter. And that's how I founded my company.
It's no secret that consumers, particularly younger consumers, right, are really stressed about the climate, as they're probably more aware than ever in terms of the effects of what could come. It's leading to what's been dubbed eco-anxiety. The United Nations has come out with a report that said 56% of people think about climate change weekly or daily. And this is a few years old now, but there's another study that said that 45% of global Gen Z, that's people between the ages of 16 and 25, said that climate anxiety affects their daily lives. And we can really expect those numbers to grow in the coming years. With all of that said, I was curious if you could tell our listeners what you're seeing when it comes to consumer stance on the climate, particularly young consumers, and really how it's showing up across their communication habits or spending.
Gen Z, more than any other generation, is concerned clearly about climate change. It is completely changing their spending habits, their consumption behaviors. We're seeing a rise of, like, I hate to say it now, but like recession core of folks really interested in like how to consume less. We saw it in the pandemic a little bit, but Gen Z wasn't, they were just getting into the world of TikTok and they're not on Instagram. So it's hard to kind of track their habits and really understand like those cultural insights. So I think ultimately like they're interested in what they can do personally, despite not understanding that like personal actions are great, but they're not like the full part of the cause.
Yeah. And how can climate communications really work to combat climate anxiety? Do you think that educational and maybe informative stories are the key to lessening the risk of eco-anxiety amongst young people?
Totally. And I think when we talk about like a backdrop of a changing world, I think we are so bent on this idea of what the world has been, and the world is really what we can create of it. So more stories around and showing, I guess more stories showing how a world looks warmer, but how folks are adapting. And I think, even the terms like adapting and mitigating are like, folks don't really understand what those are, but those are essential to this conversation that we're having around like how Gen Z can lessen their eco-anxiety.
When you think about communicating that way, do you think that falls on marketers? Do you think it's the responsibility of brands to really help bridge the knowledge gap? And what role do these types of workers, essentially marketers or people in ad land, play in combating climate change and building climate resilience amongst consumers?
Totally. I mean, like marketing and comms is 100% responsible for, especially brands that produce something. They have full responsibility for understanding their supply chain and being able to communicate it in a way that's not as confusing as the word supply chain. And I think that responsibility is only going to continue to grow. I know we've previously talking about how there might be a climate specific expert on every team. I don't think that's going to go away. I think we're only going to need more of that. The language may shift, but brands are really going to have to begin to understand their actual impact, not just on the world, but how it's affecting their consumers as well. Consumer sentiment is important.
Yeah. And say a brand came to you and said, we want to get into climate communications. We want to effectively tell climate stories. How do they get started? What does the process look like?
At C3, we have a pretty interesting process in that we love to really understand what their current communications are and who their target audience is. I say it's interesting because we typically get into the weeds of these very advanced companies and realize that they're just talking to everyone and they don't actually understand like what they're trying to do besides sell a product. And like, that's pretty normal. So for us, it's really working with these organizations to understand like where their actual climate consumer sits. So is it someone that they have to do a lot of work to convincing, or is it a fence sitter, or is it someone who's totally bought in? And that actually determines like the platforms they show up, the types of language that we use, and, the entire campaign.
Have you worked with any brands, or do you have any case studies that you can share with us that were sort of effective in their climate communications or climate storytelling?
Yeah, so more of a biodiversity client. One of my clients is Project SETI. They are working to understand how sperm whales talk to each other using artificial intelligence. It's a bunch of like Ivy universities and their researchers working on this project. So it's not like one isolated organization. It's a lot of very smart people across the globe working on this problem. The ultimate goal, though, is not really to understand like how we can talk to animals. It's how we can take that information to create better policies for non-humans. The reason that I'm using this as an example is because it kind of ties into the cultural relevance we saw with the Song of the Humpback Whales. And you take like a small insight, like our recent paper around sperm whales having actually a phonetic alphabet, and we can prove it, to the front page of the New York Times, and it just explodes. And, we've pushed the boundary with that research so far in that we actually are getting to a place where the conversations around like non-human rights are actually like manifesting in ways of like conferences, and folks really want to hear about it. I mean, like we saw on the front page of Time, I think it was this week, the de-extinction of the dire wolf. So that's just one example. But I think it like beyond like climate comms, it's great like biodiversity case study.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm curious, can anyone participate in climate communications, right? You think about maybe brands that don't have as great of a sustainability kind of plan in place, maybe fast fashion brands. Do you turn clients away? Do you help them kind of navigate how they would tell climate stories or tell their sustainability effort story? Or is it just kind of for certain brands?
I think any brand can, as long as they're willing to be transparent. And I think that's the key, no matter where you are in your journey. Transparency is the one thing that all consumers want right now, is to understand where organizations are in their journey and where they're headed. I think there's this rise of like greenwashing, for example, and a lot of that comes out of the current admin, but we've actually been seeing it for like 5 or 6 years now. And it's legacy organizations that are really just terrified of getting it wrong. And the thing about climate change is we don't actually know like where this is headed. And that's why there's so much science, and we need the communications behind it so we can consistently communicate like very transparently, like where we are in like the Earth cycle, for example. And brands have that responsibility too.
So we touched on greenwashing a little bit. I wanted to talk about greenwashing. So obviously, massive, massive issue. According to the European Commission, 42% of brands exaggerate their green credentials in marketing due to the fear of backlash, as you said, especially amongst Gen Z, who are notoriously vocal, I should say, rather, in terms of holding brands publicly accountable, calling them out when they get it wrong. Brands are really starting to have a bit of a fear in terms of speaking about the climate or telling climate stories as a result of this. How do brands essentially build the confidence to integrate climate storytelling into their messaging, but ensure that they're keeping transparency at their core? Because you did say that it's so crucial. It's such a big element here.
Yes, that's a great question. There's like an element of testing. And I think that's the thing we haven't really brought up yet is like a lot of people will say they know who their audience is, but it takes like there's like a bridge almost that you have to cross to get there, especially if you're not talking to them yet, but you probably haven't been talking about them to climate at all. So there's a lot of testing and like a phased integration approach that needs to be considered. It's not like just one day you're going to wake up and start making claims about whatever thing in the EU that you're trying to avoid. I think the interesting fact is that like the data you're sharing is out of the EU, and that is, you know, where right now the most regulations are and have been. It's where all of the standardizations are coming out. And for organizations, like how they can be conscious about this is tapping into those frameworks. A lot of work has been done to validate and verify like ISSB, for example, or CSRD. And it's a lot of work for an organization to tap into that. And a lot of organizations are scared to share the work that I'm seeing, are scared to share the work that they have to do to tap into that. But that is actually like what consumers want to know. It's totally not sexy. And this is an issue that I work with a lot with my clients, is like the least sexy things are the ones that you want to be communicating the most.
Yeah. If marketers are responsible, or maybe the press department is responsible for climate communications within a business, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I imagine that we'll need to upskill across the ad industry so that we can adequately address climate concerns and claims in brand messaging, because we need to have it backed and sort of vetted in science, right? So do you foresee a future in which marketers will need to be climate trained, right? Do you think that in the future CMOs will have to be climate scientists or semblance of climate understanding along the way?
Totally. Yeah. So we're actually seeing some universities across the US that are actually mandating that to get your degree, you have to take like a climate specific course. Looks different across every university. We're also seeing K through 12 schools that are really interested. I mean, on the note of eco-anxiety, how can they integrate like climate into their curriculum? So it becomes a conversation earlier. It's not just like CO2, air is good for us, let's plant trees. It's taking things a step further. There's a really great organization here out of the US, but they're global, called Take Action Global, that actually develops curriculums for the K through 12 student set, and they help teachers integrate them into the classroom. So, I mean, I think we're seeing it across the board. I don't think it'll be mandated. I think, you know, just given the interest and the fact that the world is actually changing, like the folks that are in these positions will just have these credentials.
I guess that's where C3 comes in, right? Like they need to rely on climate communications firms that specifically deal with this topic and have the science to back it up, to tell their stories and to vet their claims, because it becomes risky if not. And then the whole idea of greenwashing and green hushing come into play. It's sort of cyclical, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is like people in comms and marketing, myself included, like to move really fast. And like the reality is that like the climate is changing very quickly, but not as quickly as comms and marketing. So it's like folks just need to slow down, really digest the information and understand the best way to present it.
Great. We're going to switch gears slightly here. So at WGSN, we forecasted that in the coming years, we'll see an end to what's been dubbed romantic consumerism. That's this idea that you buy something because it's going to make you better, happier, more beautiful, more fulfilled, whatever it is. We're starting to see consumers really just get smarter, get savvier, and emphasize being more sort of careful and intentional with their purchases. That's where things like reuse and repair come into play. A lot of this stems from the creator space, actually, as social media spaces like TikTok really tell us that we need these products, right? More to be more beautiful or whatever it is. And while it may seem that sustainability and the creator economy are at odds, there's actually a growing class of climate creators and climate storytellers on the internet that are certainly coming to the fore, and they're gaining a lot of traction right now. How can and should brands lean on these climate storytellers?
We're just seeing, I hate to be this basic about it, we're just seeing what we saw in 2010, where fashion brands were like, Tumblr influencers, let's use those for Fashion Week. It's a new platform. It's a new version of marketing. Like, we have TikTok influencers who are climate focused, and brands should be using them. These influencers they're not your traditional influencers. They are extremely steeped in the science and the understanding of their audience. And they're never trying to sell anything but a better planet, which is like personally why I love them.
It's kind of like derm talk. I don't know if that rings a bell, but like when you want to hear about skincare, you want like a dermatologist to tell you about it. You don't want like a random, 20-year-old. I hate to say it, but that's quite true, right? You want that science element. I think it's similar when you talk about the climate and climate storytelling. You want people who are embedded in the space telling these stories. And I guess my question is, are there any that come to mind that are doing a really good job cutting through at the moment? Any climate storytellers?
Yeah. So I think on like the very large scale, there's Raleigh Williams, who runs Climate Town, very well-known YouTube channel at this point. We both started in the same university, and he has really taken his like comedic spirit and added it to the world of climate. So like the masses can really understand very specific case studies within climate. And then I think on like the younger side of things, a very good friend of mine, Susie Hicks, the climate chick, is actually working to transform climate storytelling for the youth. So she's been dubbed like the Bill Nye of our generation. And, so you see it on both ends. And that kind of speaks to like how this is just becoming like a cultural conversation.
Yeah, oftentimes when you think about climate stories, they are quite educational, quite serious, right? But it could also be humorous, right? They could be funny and joyful. Are there any creators kind of leaning into that space? I know you had mentioned one who I believe went to the White House, you were saying when we spoke last.
That was Raleigh, yeah.
Yeah.
So he does a lot of like comedy work. I mean, he does stand up on the side well beyond like climate stuff, but it lends itself pretty well. But to the point of like comedy and inserting joy, we're only going to continue to see more of that. I know that there are a lot of producers in Hollywood, for example, that are leaning on climate folks to help understand how to bridge that gap right now. So yeah, I think we're only going to see more of that, hopefully, because that is really like what sticks with folks and not the doom and gloom necessarily.
Yeah, off the conversation of just social media and climate storytelling within those spaces, what's your take on trends like underconsumption core, de-influencing? De-influencing is an interesting one for me because it's telling you not to buy the products, right? It's like the antithesis of romantic consumerism. It's the influencer hopping on. They might not even be climate storytellers, but they're saying, actually, don't buy this mascara because it doesn't do what it says it does. Do you think that this trend could actually sway the way that we consume on social media and within the context of the creator economy at large?
The de-influence comes not just from like a product being bad, but also like, is the company doing things that are ethical? So it's more, we're entering now like a time that the conversation isn't just about like, do we like this product? Does it perform? But like, is the corporation doing what they're supposed to be doing for our planet? And that's a really interesting space to be. I don't think the de-influencing is going to go away. It's like probably one of my favorite trends. Same with underconsumption core. I think that's just going to continue to grow. Again, I mentioned the recession earlier. I think we're just in for a very wild ride. And I think folks are really going to lean into it. And that's a really interesting way to create content.
A bit earlier, you talked about how climate is being kind of embedded into entertainment stories, right? You've mentioned to me before cli-fi. I would love if you could define for our listeners what is cli-fi and perhaps how it's being used to tell important climate stories. Obviously, that's not something that's brand new. We've always had science fiction kind of telling future stories in large entertainment mediums, but how is climate fiction or cli-fi different?
Yeah, so cli-fi or climate fiction is a little bit different because it uses like actual timescales and science to take what is typically sci-fi and make it our future reality. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, like sci-fi can feel very dystopian. Cli-fi can also feel very dystopian, but it's based in facts. So we had talked about previously Gabrielle Korn's recent book, The Shoutouts, and that takes place in like a 2040 world that's like warming. It's interesting because she wrote this before the last presidential election, and it was under the assumption that Donald Trump won. So we're beginning to see that time scale actually shift up of what she's showcasing in the book. And I think it creates this interesting dialogue of like, typically, we're used to seeing sci-fi being projected like 100 years out, for example, electric cars, for example. And now we're actually seeing like folks are suffering from the water crisis right now, but that was predicted in books like 10 years ago. So the timeline is much shorter. And I think that's where a lot of the interest lies.
So I know you mentioned that you are a professor at NYU. You've been there for about a decade. Can you tell us how climate change curriculum has really evolved over this past decade?
Yeah, so I actually started at NYU by writing their first social media course. So back a decade ago when brands were just trying to understand, I think, how to enter the space, and folks were really upskilling in social media in general across the board. It was in 2017 when I started pushing the board at the university to start thinking about a climate communications curriculum. And I mean, it was the same as when I went to Columbia. They were like, what is climate communications? But an interesting thing started happening in 2018. We had more and more graduate level researchers coming to the board saying, I want my thesis to be in sustainability or climate and the overlap of like corporate communications. And then it created this interesting cycle where I began taking on more and more student researchers to help oversee these white papers from 2018 onward. And then the university came to me in the last like year and had asked like, can you develop a climate communications curriculum? We're actually seeing a demand for this now. So the demand only really started, I'd have to say, in 2018, but it's been like very steady in growth. And that is all because of the students. So I'm like personally very grateful for that.
Obviously, you've talked about the K-12 evolution curriculum where we're starting to see some school districts, particularly within America, actually mandate sustainability knowledge for, Gen Alpha, Gen Z even. Obviously, we'll start to see that with Gen Beta too as they enter those years. We're starting to see it at the university level. Arizona State has made it mandatory to graduate. You need a sustainability course to do so. Is this even enough, though? Are we doing enough for future generations by mandating these courses? What else can we be doing to kind of move the needle even further?
I personally don't think we're doing enough. That's just my hot take. That will always be my hot take. I think that until my job is unnecessary, like we need this. And also like until our world is not warming to the extent that it is, we also need this. So that's kind of why I sit where I sit on that. What more we can be doing is, I think like the reason that I love working with Take Action Global is because they're doing the work so early to work with these kids and helping give them language to the feelings that they're feeling, but also the science in a way that they can understand it. I don't think that should end at any point. I think that, we should be requiring more classes in university. I would have loved at my like FIT school if I would have like had to take a climate course versus like a physical education course. I know they're both like equally like important, but like that's my hot take on it.
I do know that. I also went to FIT and I could have done without like the dance course I had to do. I want to end on a happier note. So obviously a lot of climate storytelling can be a bit doom and gloom. You probably feel that deeply because you are in this space every day. I know that when I'm forecasting around the environment and planetary health, it can be quite draining sometimes because it does feel hopeless at times. But in reality, there is some hope, some joy, and some just positivity that could emerge from this space. I'm curious, can you highlight some ways that we're seeing joy embedded into the climate conversation beyond the humor and the climate creators that we've talked about earlier?
Yeah, I think people are engaged, or I know people are engaged. We had the biggest climate protest we've ever seen just like a month ago. It made the front page of the New York Times, which that's never happened before. I personally find hope in that people are interested, that we're having conversations like these. I love that more people are trying to enter the space. It just shows that there is an interest, that we do need change. And for me, like, we're actually beginning to see system change. So we're seeing a lot of politicians that are like younger politicians that are entering the space that actually have climate platforms. And not that like politicians haven't had that before, like shout out to Bernie Sanders. It's just like, we're seeing more and more of it, and climate can be so doom and gloom, but that is also a very quick way to be paralyzed in action. So in everything that I do, it is from like an optimistic point of view.
Yeah, well, this has been a very informative conversation. I've wanted to talk to you forever. We've been like LinkedIn acquaintances for years, but it's been so inspiring to listen to this. I've written about climate communication, so it's really lovely to hear from an authority figure in this space. If you could leave our listeners with one thing to know about the climate communication space, what would that be? Is there anything that they can do to get started, for example?
Just start. Tap into your community, really understand what they want. And that can be as simple as like posting an Instagram story with a Q&A sticker.
Nice. Just kind of get started.
Yeah. That's all
Step
I got.
one.
Just step one. Just do it.
Nice. And then at the end of each episode, I ask every single guest, who is somebody that you admire who's creating a new version of tomorrow that you think is really inspiring? So who comes to mind for you?
I would have to say Gabrielle Korn. I had mentioned her earlier on the podcast, but she does a lot of work to really understand where our climate is going, how our systems are breaking, and translate them for mass consumers. And I think that is just so inspiring.
Thank you to my guest, Nicole Loher, founder of climate communications firm C3. If you're a WGSN subscriber, look out for more trends at WGSN.com. If you're not a subscriber, please come and discover our services. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time for our next episode. In the meantime, you can catch the CEO of WGSN, Carla Buzashi, next week on our other podcast, Lives of Tomorrow. I'm your host, Cassandra Napoli. Be sure to follow and subscribe to this podcast, and see you next time.